A lot of allegations flying around. Certainly, a lot of Trump supporters upset that the president's concerns about the election are not being heeded by the media. But what can you expect? The media is never going to really play ball with anything the president says. In fact, they'll actively try and suppress it. But there are some important developments that have taken place over the weekend that do have meat on the bones. For instance, Justice Alito issued a temporary order requiring Pennsylvania election officials to segregate ballots that they receive after 8 o'clock p.m. on Election Day. And, Joe, as I understand it, there's still a case pending before the Supreme Court, which could involve saying that those ballots are disqualified, the ones that are received after Election Day. What should we make of the Supreme Court and what's happening in Pennsylvania?
It's very important. First of all, full disclosure, I and my wife, Victoria Tunsing, and law partner, are working on the Trump litigation. We're working with Rudy Giuliani, and we have spent the last few days interviewing witnesses, getting affidavits and declarations for this litigation. Okay. So let's get that out of the way. Obviously, I'm a partisan and have been for a very long time for President Trump. Now, Alito's order is very important because what it does is it preserves the issue of nullifying all the votes that violated the law. Remember, what happened in Pennsylvania is that the state decided on its own to violate the governor and the Secretary of State, decided to start to allow the counting of ballots after November 3rd, even though the state legislature, which under the Constitution of the United States is the only body in Pennsylvania that can set the rules for elections, even though the legislature had said, no, everything's done by November 3rd. So it is clear that what happened in Pennsylvania was blatantly unconstitutional. The Supreme Court knows that. That's why Alito issued his order. Now, what happens if the state does not segregate those votes, or if it can't? Suppose they can't. Suppose they won't be able to verify because the ballots that the votes came in are no longer available. The remedy is clear. The remedy is that all of those votes must be disqualified. You compound that with the fact that in Philadelphia, the city of brotherly theft, the Republican count watchers were systematically excluded from being legitimate observers. In other words, they may have been allowed inside the big room, but they were never allowed to be close enough to actually see how the ballots were being handled, what was on the ballots. They could not read them. That is not observation. That is denial. So listen, Pennsylvania is a basket of corruption and a basket of violations. Now, all people are quibbling about, it's not really fraud if you can't get in and see things. That's your problem. We'll give you a set of binoculars. Listen, whether you call it fraud or whether you call it systematic irregularities, it's the same thing. It's stealing. You can steal by means of fraud. You can steal by other means. What went on in Pennsylvania and in Philadelphia was plain and simple theft by the governor and the Attorney General of the state and the Secretary of State. And remember, this is one of those secretaries of state that George Soros bought and paid for, many of them all over the United States. So bottom line is Sam Alito's order is basically the magic bullet because it bases the entire question of the vote in Pennsylvania on Article 1 of the U.S. Constitution. And that means that everything that happened did not happen with the permission of the state legislature as required by the Constitution and is therefore illegal and null and void. The remedy, you have to disqualify every one of those votes, and it could be as many as 800,000.
Okay, Joe, there is a question of whether 25 counties have not indicated whether they were separating the ballots. If they did not separate them and they got counted, they just get put in with everything else. How are they going to know which one of those ballots should have been separated out and should be discounted if they've already been counted?
That's a very good question, and there isn't any readily available answer to that. However, the question then becomes, do you give the benefit of the doubt to the elected officials who violated Article 1 of the United States Constitution and allow them to disobey a Supreme Court order and previously disobey the United States Constitution and give them the benefit of the doubt? Or do you give the benefit of the doubt to those who say, since you cannot tell me what you did with those unconstitutional ballots, then everything is null and void? It is a very complicated matter, and it's the chaos that the Democrats wanted all over the United States. Remember, Democrats spent the last 2 years filing hundreds of lawsuits all over the United States to nullify election law for mail-in balloting, to make it easier for people to vote that way, and to eliminate methods of verification that those mail-in ballots were accurate. Do you reward states and Democratic parties all over the country by allowing all of those votes to count? Now, the remedy seems draconian, and it seems very difficult to accept that you could set aside whole votes. But how much is obeying the Constitution worth? You either have Article 1 or you don't. And if you don't enforce it, then Article 1 is a nullity. I don't see where the Supreme Court has any choice, particularly in Pennsylvania, but to set aside at least 800,000 votes.
And by the way, the legal claims here, I think, are pretty easy for the layman to understand. Like, yes, people should have access by law to observe the votes being counted. And yes, the Supreme Court has now intervened and said, yes, those votes should be separated out that come in after Election Day, pending our decision about what to do about those votes. Very easy to understand. But Pennsylvania, Joe, is just one state. It's a big one. It's 20 electoral votes. But in order for a plausible path for Trump to actually turn this whole thing around to occur, he would have to secure other legal victories in other states. So where else should we look on the map, and what do you think actually has the most legal meat on the bone to do that?
Well, there's a slew of cases that are going to be filed today, tomorrow, and Wednesday all over the United States. Michigan's a problem for the Democrats. Wisconsin is a clear problem. Georgia has some anomalies. Of course, there's Pennsylvania. Nevada has very, very serious problems. Arizona, I don't know. Arizona seems to me a state that the president has to win. He has to win Arizona in order to make the numbers work. But as far as the number of states, there are about 5 or 6 more where there are serious problems and where the issues of how you remedy that are going to have to come into play. So we're going to know more. Remember, Al Gore had 37 days to do this. We are just in the beginning stages of this. And remember, back in 2000, it was one state and one count in that state, and that was it. And George Bush won every recount. We are now in a situation where we have multiple states. Not a single vote has been certified in any state. And I know the media has declared Joe Biden president-elect, and so has some foreign leaders. But last time I looked, it's the American people who make that decision.
That's right. Okay, more from Joe diGenova in just a second. We're keeping Joe with us. Lots of questions for him.
And we're here with Joe diGenova, legal analyst, former U.S. attorney to the District of Columbia. Joe, you were just talking about how the Democrats have had lawyers in courts for 2 years so that they could, create chaos. They could have all these ways to, in your words, influence the election. Should Republicans have anticipated this, and did they? What did they do?
They did. They were in every one of those states and every one of those courts fighting back. But what you have is when you have local courts and state courts, it's very political, whether or not anyone likes to admit that or not. All you have to do is look at Pennsylvania, which has historically been one of the most politically corrupt judiciaries in the country. There have been scandals in the Pennsylvania Supreme Court, scandals in their juvenile justice. I mean, it's an appalling place. A totally appalling place. So the question then becomes, what did you do? And the answer is the Democrats were very successful in many of these states in getting the rules changed with regard to mail-in ballot, but not through the state legislatures. So the answer is in those cases where there's lawsuits being filed, that issue of Article 1 will come up. Those cases are not over yet. They're still there. And, it's much more difficult once you've had an election and the votes, quote unquote, have been tallied, but there have been no certifications yet. But the Republicans were there. They had lawyers all over the United States fighting these Democratic lawsuits.
Gotcha.
Joe, actually, could you help us out this morning? You're on the Trump legal team. You're working with Rudy Giuliani. Is it fair to say you're on the official legal team? Is that the way to assess this?
That would be true.
Okay. And so who else is on that team, if you can share with us? What other lawyers has the president hired to make this effort?
There are names which you would not be familiar with who are classic election law lawyers all over the United States who work for the Republican Party and do things like this all the time in county, municipal, state, and federal elections. There's about 50 to 100 lawyers all over the United States from law firms, small and large, who work on this stuff all the time. They're very, very good at what they do. They're superb. They have constitutional law expertise. So the notion that all these people say, well, why wasn't Trump prepared? The answer is he was. But here's the problem. You cannot be prepared for wholesale theft. You cannot be prepared ever enough to account for the kind of illegality that has permeated this election. Now, we shall see how it all works out, and we will see if, the Supreme Court puts on its big boy and big girl pants and skirts and comes up with the correct answer here. Just remember, everybody has to remember, this is about Article 1 of the Constitution. This isn't some little arcane law. This is the Constitution of the United States. And the Democrats have succeeded in violating Article 1 and having the practical effect of amending laws without using their state legislatures all over the country. But believe me, President Trump has plenty of troops, and they're all very good people. You wouldn't know a single name if I told you.
So we have Lindsey Graham asking the DOJ to investigate after a U.S. postal whistleblower came forward. And we also have claims of a Detroit City worker blowing the whistle and claiming that ballots were backdated. Apparently, the FBI is involved in that. In Detroit, you've got 2 poll workers who have also signed affidavits. So that is all coming forward. But my question is, where's Bill Barr? I would think you mentioned Philadelphia. You mentioned that you talked about how poll workers were barred. In Detroit, Republican poll workers were actually barred from the floor. What was going on in Philadelphia when they weren't there? How come the people who barred them and broke federal law have not been arrested? If you break federal law, you should be arrested, period, right?
Well, arresting people is one thing. Taking action in court civilly to enforce that law is another thing. I do not have an answer to where the Justice Department is or was. I certainly know where the FBI is. They're nowhere to be found except in a couple of field offices around the country where complaints have been filed and are being investigated. History will tell us within the next 30 days what Bill Barr will do, if anything, and whether or not it will have an impact on the election. And I mean, can you imagine what's going on inside that building right now where the Durham probe was put on hold purposely so that they wouldn't interfere in the election? What's going to come out now? Is there going to be a Durham report? Are there going to be more indictments? I've been told there are going to be indictments. But think about that happening in the midst of this recount and the implications of that. By the way, it shows exactly why when you have an opportunity to act and it's your duty to do so, you should act. You never wait. You never postpone because you think, well, this might not look good. That's not the way things are supposed to happen. You do things whether they look good or not. Just ask the Supreme Court. Alito has to issue a last-minute order telling Pennsylvania to segregate ballots because the court waited and didn't do something a couple of weeks before when it might have staunched this tide. So now the Supreme Court has a much more difficult decision politically. If they decide that there was massive irregularities in violation of Article 1, there's only one remedy. You have to nullify the votes. Now, how's that going to look? The bottom line is you either do it when you can or you don't do it.
Yeah, well,
amazing. But I'm sorry.
Go ahead, Joe.
Before we let Joe go, I'm getting a bunch of questions sent to me right now about one guy. This name just keeps on popping up. So, Chief Justice John Roberts. Everyone wants to know what Joe diGenova thinks of him and his role in all of this. What's the answer to that, Joe?
You can't print it. I think John Roberts is an accommodator. I think he worries about the Georgetown cocktail circuit, how he's going to be viewed, how he's going to be accepted. His fate was sealed when he allowed the President of the United States, Barack Obama, in the 2011 State of the Union address to lambaste the Supreme Court in his face for Citizens United case. And then later on, 2 years later, when the Obamacare was before the Supreme Court and Roberts was going to vote with the majority to hold it unconstitutional, Obama went after him during deliberations and slammed him, saying he would be an illegitimate Chief Justice. And by God, if Roberts didn't fold and switched his vote to uphold Obamacare. Roberts has written his own history. It's capitulation. It is falling prey to Washington. I cannot stand John Roberts. And he may be dragged along in this situation because we now have a legitimate fifth conservative vote. But as for Roberts, I have to be careful. I'm still a lawyer and he's still the Chief Justice. But my God, what a pathetic display by Chief Justice Roberts.
All right. Yeah. Meanwhile, by the way, he also attacked Trump in 2018. He said, we don't have Obama judges or Trump judges.
Oh, yeah.
Came out and did that. Joe diGenova, thank you. You got a lot of work ahead of you. Thanks. Really appreciate
Joe.
you taking some time out as always.